I'm Lindy Johnson, and I'm one of the co-directors for the Center for Innovation and Learning Design at the School of Education at the College of William & Mary. And today we have the pleasure to talk to Pedro Noguera. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. He is a distinguished professor of education in the Graduate School of Education and Information Sciences at UCLA. And his research focuses on the ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions. And he's also speaking tonight in the School of Education on equity, innovation, and deeper learning. So I'm just curious if you can tell us a little bit about how did you come into the field of education to begin with? Were you a teacher, or what was your beginning?
So I started teaching while I was an undergraduate at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. So my first teaching was in Providence, high school, then middle school.
Okay.
But I really didn't expect to become a teacher or to go into education. I went immediately into a PhD program at Berkeley in sociology.
Okay.
And my focus was not education. It was on political change in the Caribbean.
Oh, wow.
But while I was in graduate school at Berkeley, I continued to teach part-time as a way to support myself in graduate school in Oakland.
Okay.
And so I always had a foot in education, but I didn't see it as... it wasn't my area of research or something I thought I was going to do long term. It was really for very practical reasons, to make some money, and I also found that it was a great way to know and learn about the community that I was in, both in Providence and then later in the Bay Area. So when I finished my degree at Berkeley, I was on the job market, and I was recruited by the School of Education at Berkeley to a new program they developed called Social and Cultural Studies, which was where they put all the people who really didn't fit anywhere else.
Okay.
Sociologists, anthropologists, philosophers, and two anthropologists there, Jean Lave and Carol Stack, recruited me, and I was thinking about going elsewhere. And since I already lived in Berkeley, I said, well, I like Berkeley, I'll just stay.
Yeah.
So it worked out.
Berkeley's a great town.
A great town. And it was unusual because Berkeley's the kind of university that doesn't usually hire its own. So that was different too. But that's where I started. And then once I entered the School of Education, it was very easy for me to pivot my work away from the Caribbean, although I continued to do some work there, and actually also on education.
Okay.
And then to focus much more on urban education, because I had been teaching at a local high school in Berkeley, and then I got recruited to run for the school board. So here I am, brand new faculty member, serving on the school board, teaching high school, and now teaching at the university. So that was unusual to have that combination of roles, but it turned out I learned so much about the field from that kind of work across sectors.
Yeah, that's. I mean, and you can really, I can see that. I mean, that background makes sense because so much of your work kind of talks about the importance of getting stakeholders together, and getting them on the same page, which I love. And can you talk a little bit about how this book came to be? What was your idea or kind of inspiration to write excellence, or to compile kind of excellence through equity?
So, it's interesting. Equity, I think, is confusing to most people, and it hasn't been a central feature of American educational policy. Although I think that's beginning to change. I see signs of it, and that's what might seem surprising, because you think about No Child Left Behind, which was, I think, intended to be a policy that would ensure that we were in fact educating all kids. Right. That was, I think, the reason why Ted Kennedy and George Miller supported it. It was a bipartisan law initially, but it quickly became something very different. Right. It was all about standards and accountability. No clear guidance to schools about how to support, in fact, all kinds of kids, and no strategy for dealing with poverty. And that, to me, was a crucial flaw, because anybody who knows about education knows that poverty impacts learning, it impacts school funding, it impacts children's needs and child development. And so we were asking schools to get better results, but giving them no guidance on how to do so. The Obama administration, surprisingly, continued on that path and really just continued to use pressure as a strategy to improve results from schools, again without guidance. Invariably, the schools that have had the most trouble, the schools where poverty's been concentrated, and though there's been nothing to do for those schools except to close them down.
Right.
And we've seen that happen in many parts of the country. We've seen mass school closures in places like Detroit, Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, but not a plan for what to do to improve schools. So as a consequence, what we're seeing now is a disinvestment in public education in some of the poorest communities across the country. And that to me is a real problem. And so we did the book because we thought that we need to give some clear guidance to practitioners, and maybe even hopefully some policymakers might read it. What would it take to really think about how to use education as a means to improve communities, and expand opportunity for children, poor children, but also what would it take to get districts that serve a more diverse population to not perceive equity as being at the expense of excellence, right? In many of our more diverse communities, I think Virginia Beach, for example, is a very diverse place, but the schools tend to be segregated based on race and income, and the perception is that the more you do for poor children of color, the less you're going to do for affluent white children. And as long as that's the perception, then poor children will lose, because the parents of affluent white children are more powerful, more influential, better able to ensure that the district and the schools are responsive to their needs.
Right.
And what we had to show is that equity is something that can benefit all children, because there are many affluent white children who have needs that are not being met in school too. And that if we really start to think about who are the children, how do we design schools that are responsive to the needs of children, all children, then we can create a strategy, a set of strategies that allow us to serve all children well, rather than choosing some over others. And that was the goal behind the book. And we thought that we need to highlight examples of schools and districts where that, in fact, is occurring, where you see high standards being made available and accessible to a broad range of kids without compromising rigor, without compromising our focus on outcomes for kids. And so that was the goal in doing a book like this, is to really show it can be done.
It can be done. And I love the kind of the diverse voices that you feature in the book. How did you choose who was going to contribute? Were these personal connections, or how did you kind of assemble your team of contributors?
Largely personal connections. For the last 25 years, I've been traveling the country, meeting educational leaders, and learning a lot about what's going on in schools and districts. And the truth is, we could do a volume 2, and probably should, because there are so many other examples, rural schools, schools serving English language learners that need attention, because so many other communities are struggling with those issues. But we thought that we need to show that there are, in fact, positive examples people can learn from. There are a number of places where there are high-performing classrooms, or even a high-performing school.
Right.
Very rare to find high-performing districts. And so we thought we needed to do that too.
Yeah.
So we thought that in order to make it compelling and clear, we had to give concrete evidence. And we asked the practitioners to write the chapters and to tell their story about the work they've been doing.
That's great. Yeah, so can you talk a little bit about this idea of equity and privileged folks really thinking that equity is going to take away from their children? Because I think that does seem to be a concern, even here in Williamsburg, where there actually are a lot of pockets of poverty and homelessness, but it's really easy to just, those problems almost become invisible because there's a large kind of, more privileged population. So how do you start changing those perceptions and educating those folks about the fact that equity actually, I think it lifts, it lifts everybody up.
Right. Well, it's not easy to change those perceptions, because they're deeply ingrained in our culture. And I would also say that what's driving inequity in schools is the inequity in our society. The more privileged, the more affluent families have more power, more influence. The less privileged, the more disadvantaged, as you said, they are more powerless, and their ability to influence what's happening to their children is much more limited. So if we're going to make equity more of a priority, more central, then the educators have to be very clear on what it takes to serve a broad range of kids. So that starts from rethinking assumptions about children, about learning. We come from a society where we tend to believe that some children are inherently smarter than others, right? They're just gifted, right? And I don't question that there may in fact be, there are in fact some children who are gifted in some ways. I just think we don't know which ones they are. And I think that we tend to confuse being privileged with being gifted. And what I mean by that is we've known for a long time that family income, parent education has an enormous influence on child development. And not surprisingly, my daughter, who is 4, she has the vocabulary of a 10-year-old. She can write, she can read, she can do all kinds of things. She's not even in kindergarten. Well, that's because her mom has a PhD from Harvard. Well, that's a huge advantage. It doesn't mean a child growing up in the housing projects or the trailer parks who's not had that kind of exposure because their mom wasn't doesn't have a college degree, doesn't also have enormous potential. And equity, once we start by recognizing that some potential is latent and has to be developed, then we need to enact strategies that allow us to ensure that all kinds of kids, not just the most privileged, have the opportunity to develop their skills and to use education to become empowered as learners. Which means that, so if we challenge the assumption, recognize that gifts are randomly distributed in our society, they're not just in wealthy communities, but they're in other communities as well, that in fact we need an educational system that's focused on cultivating talents and strengths in children, not premised on sorting children, which is what we've been doing. And so once you establish that, then you begin to enact strategies that allow you to develop talents in kids, that allow you to be more responsive to the needs, that allow you to see that the academic needs, the social needs, the physical needs of a child are all interrelated. And which sounds logical, right? Hungry kids don't do well in school, but we ignore that. We tend to ignore the fact that the kids with the greatest social and psychological needs also tend to be the kids who do least well academically. We need strategies that allow us to meet those needs so the kids have a chance to be successful academically. And we need to make sure that the schools that are serving high poverty children have the resources and have a staff, a faculty that knows how to meet the needs of the kids. We haven't even begun to do that work.
So there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
A lot of work.
Right? You talked about designing a school that serves all children well and kind of personalizes the learning for the kid, whatever their gifts may be. So do you see kind of deeper learning schools? We're hearing a lot about deeper learning schools as a way to get at that. I mean, what does a school look like that serves all children well? So
deeper learning, and that's what we're going to speak about tonight, is only going to serve as a means to foster equity if equity is the central focus. If we recognize that all children can engage in deeper learning and should, right? Now, for those who might question that, I would just challenge you and say, what is the most common question posed by a 3-year-old? And all 3-year-olds are consumed with the question why. They want to know why things are the way they are. That is, that they are innately curious. Children are. They are constantly trying to discover the world around them. Our job as educators should be to encourage that curiosity, to encourage and to feed that desire to know, that desire to learn, which is very different than what we typically do in schools. In most schools, we present the world as these are the facts you need to master to be an educated person. So we engage in strategies that tend to be much more didactic, and our learning focuses much more on memorization than on the higher order skills that we know develop cognitive ability, like the ability to apply knowledge, the ability to evaluate and to make sense of the world through education. Those are the deeper learning strategies that all children need to be engaged in. To me, the program or the approach that epitomizes that is the Montessori schools. And if you go to a good Montessori school, you see kids engaged in deeper learning at very early ages.
Right.
And they're also developing, because they're doing deeper learning, they're developing concentration skills. They're developing that intrinsic desire to learn very early. And what many people forget is that Maria Montessori, who was a physician, not an educator, started her schools with the poorest children in Rome.
Right.
But when the Montessori methods were imported in the United States, became almost exclusively available to the affluent children. So it's not as though that was for whom it was intended. But we tend to limit those deeper learning strategies to what the kids we think are advanced.
Are ready for it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Whereas the other kids we think they just need direct instruction.
They need the facts. Yeah. So what do you, so you talked about, you actually kind of came to education through a circuitous route, and here at William & Mary we have wonderful, passionate, high-achieving undergraduates. Some of them come to us and say, I really want to be a teacher, but other folks are talking me out of the business. What would you say, or what advice might you give to a young person who is considering, going into education, but just feels like, wow, teachers are pretty disenfranchised right now. They're not really respected. There's not the financial compensation. How do we get kids to go into teaching when we know it's a tough job?
It's a tough job, and it's become tougher. We have a teaching shortage now across the country because a lot of people are leaving the profession too quickly.
Right.
And that's because I think the conditions many teachers work under are not sustainable. And that also impacts learning.
Right.
What I would say to undergrads, what I say to them when they speak to me about it, I say, it's a great field. You have to be very clear about why you're going into it, because it's going to be very challenging. It's going to be difficult. And you have to recognize that teaching is very complex and it requires a high level of skill.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the problems I see right now is we don't appreciate the degree of skill involved in teaching. To be an effective teacher, you have to know the content very well that you're going to teach. You have to have strengths in a wide variety of pedagogical strategies so you can teach in many different ways and use technology and other things as a way to engage students. And you have to know how to build relationships with children across race, socioeconomic status, language, culture, etc. Those are huge skills that, you think about just how difficult it is, for example, to teach a child to read. Many outsiders have no clue of what goes into it, especially if a child is dyslexic or a child is an English language learner. It is so challenging to do that. And I think if we understood and appreciated the great skill involved in teaching, we would have much more reverence for it and support teachers much more than we do now. I was talking to a teacher who was at a conference I spoke at last week, and he was visiting from Iceland. And I said, wow, how does a teacher from Iceland come? He said, well, I'm in my sabbatical year. I said, you're a sabbatical year? He said, yeah, after 7 years of teaching, we get a year sabbatical. That's paid leave. And the expectation is we're going to study, we're going to use the time to enhance our knowledge and skills as teachers. And so that's why I'm in the United States going to conferences.
Sounds like a dream.
Sounds like a dream.
Sounds
But it
like
sounds
a dream.
like what a society that was interested in really furthering education would do. We have to invest in the people who do the work.
Absolutely. Let's see, I just have a couple more questions for you. Some of the teachers that we've talked to have said, we know that this work does require big policy, high-level change. Does the teacher and the classroom level, do they still have kind of some power over their focus on teaching, for equity? What if they're in a school where that isn't what, everyone's not on the same page? Are there certain strategies that one teacher can focus on to make a little dent, or is this all really kind of high level change that needs to occur?
Well, ideally, you want changes to occur on multiple levels. You want, and I think Virginia actually is a leader because I I know your state superintendent and Steve Staples, and I think he does get it because he's a former teacher. That you need to empower teachers, and you need to focus on the conditions in schools that foster engagement. However, there are many districts that are not there. They are still stuck on narrowly focusing on achievement as measured by test scores. They don't trust their teachers, so they have administrators in classrooms making sure the teachers on the right page on a particular day or doing it the way they want them to do it. And the sad thing is that drives many of our most creative people out of teaching. Teaching is creative work, and what we want teachers to be empowered to find a variety of strategies for engaging students. And that's why the art of teaching also has to be cultivated. There are skills that need to be learned, but there's also the creative aspect of teaching that we need to encourage our students, our teachers to develop on their own or with their colleagues. And so my hope is that there are principals and superintendents who also understand that we want to empower students as learners, and we want to empower teachers as professionals. And empowerment simply means being very clear about what good teaching is, how to do it, but also keeping the space there for teachers to be decision makers about how to engage different children, about how to, for example, one of the big questions for an educator is depth versus breadth. Right? How deep do we go with a particular lesson to ensure that children really understand a concept, right? So that we're not just moving them on before they have a strong foundation. At the same time, we want some breadth in the curriculum because we want to make sure that they are exposed to a variety of knowledge and skills, and so that during the course of their education, they have exposure to the knowledge that we think is important, whether that be, depending on the field, in science or history, that they have some exposure. Being an educated person should mean some degree of cultural literacy, right? To use the term Edie Hirsch has made famous. And I don't disagree with that, although we might disagree about what should be in it. So that conversation about depth versus breadth is a very important one for educators to have. But I think sadly in some schools there are administrators who are making that decision and who are controlling their teachers because they don't trust them enough to make wise decisions on their own.
I totally agree, and the teachers that I have talked with, I think really do appreciate and want those opportunities to make decisions and have a say in how their schools run. So we've talked a lot about practitioners and teachers. Just switching gears a tiny bit, what do you see as kind of crucial areas for research in this area? Are there particular questions that you, for example, are looking at right now in terms of the gaps in the research around equity or policy change?
So I'm a sociologist by training. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a cognitive scientist, as they call it now. But I'm very concerned about learning. I think we focus so much on achievement in the last few years. We've focused so little on learning. And I really think that if we focused more on learning, how do we create conditions in classrooms, in schools, that are conducive to learning, where kids become excited and motivated about learning? I think that's what we should be focused on. And I think we would end up with very different schools than we have right now. It is rare, sadly, for kids to come home at the end of a school day and tell their parents, wow, what a day I had. It was fantastic. I learned so much. We did so many interesting things. I read this great book. It should be that happens much more often than it does right now. At the same time, I think that in thinking about school reform, we've missed a really basic question, right? That is, how do we have to organize schools? And how do we have to prepare educators to meet the needs of the children they'll serve? That's the fundamental question we should be asking. Because I would say right now there's a lack of alignment. The skills of the teachers don't match the needs of the kids. And because they don't match them, they don't know how to teach those kids. And it's showing up in the large numbers of kids that are poorly educated, right? And I don't just mean the poor kids. I see a lot of affluent kids who end up coming to college who are really not prepared for college. They haven't written enough. They don't know how to do independent research. They haven't been challenged really, and So I think the lack of alignment between the way we organize schools and the way we deliver education to children and engage them is a real problem that we barely addressed so far.
So this summer, the Center for Innovation Learning Design is bringing together teams of principals and teachers to try to help them reimagine their school culture. What do you think, and one of the things that we found is that teachers and principals aren't really having deep discussions about learning and what happens in the classroom. A lot of times it's about logistics, it's about buses, it's about discipline, but it's not about the actual learning of kids. What kinds of conversations do you think are essential for principals and teachers and even other stakeholders in the school to start having in order to kind of develop this shared vision or kind of get on the same page about their core beliefs? Because we don't see those conversations happening very often in a lot of the schools we're working in.
So I think the culture, the focus of school culture is a good one because it tends to be ignored. I often remind people that all schools have a culture.
Yes.
It's just that some cultures are better than others. And a culture is characterized by the quality of the relationships among the adults and between the adults and the children, by the values and the norms of a school, by the sense of shared mission and purpose. But it's very important that as we engage educators in conversations about school culture and how to create cultures that are conducive to teaching and learning, that they not lose sight of the teaching and learning part, right? That they all have to go together, right? And I think that too often in education, we take such a fragmented approach. We'll have a session on technology, we'll have a session on culture, we'll have a session on curriculum, classroom management, and we don't integrate them. And we have to integrate. You can't, for example, school discipline. You can't teach in a school that's chaotic, in a school where kids are out of control. At the same time, that gets people fixated on classroom management and on behavior.
Right.
The ultimately, the best behavior strategy is academic engagement. Right? Kids who are academically engaged are less disruptive, right? So you have to think about discipline in relation to the larger educational strategies of a school, not in isolation. And it's getting people to think more systemically and in a more integrated manner that I think is the real challenge, right? We assign in many school districts the least prepared teachers to the most challenging kids. Why would we do that? Why does Teach for America do that, right? Now, some people say, well, it's better, than the ineffective teachers that we assign to them. But why are we doing that? Right. That's not the strategy either, right? So we need to rethink many approaches that we take and really ask a different set of questions about how to make schools more responsive to the needs of students.
Well, that's wonderful. You've given me definitely a lot to think about, and of course I look forward to attending your talk tonight. But thanks so much for talking with me.
Thank
really
you, Wendy.
Appreciate it.